B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Tuesday, February 13th, 2018. And it's icy cold at the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea. I've been trying to watch on NBC, but they are so jingoistic. It's all about the Americans. And I like a little bit of snowboarding. But that's all I could find last night. A little bit of the giant slalom, which is one of my favorites. But alongside the Olympics, it appears that the cold weather there has produced at least a partial thaw in the relations between North and South Korea. And as you know, Mike Pence, the biblical thumping vice president, was on hand for the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, and he was seated just in front of Kim Jong-un's sister. The North Korean head of state is what she is called. And while Pence talked tough and looked tough and wouldn't shake hands with the North Korean woman, it appears that he did soften a little bit the U.S. stance in his discussions with President Moon of South Korea. And the upshot is today, after checking with higher authorities in Washington, the South Korean government said the United States, too, looks positively at South-North Korean dialogue and has expressed its willingness to start dialogue with the North. Now, my own view is that the U.S. should get out of the way and let the North and South conduct talks on their own. Because the whole idea that we legitimize the threats of Kim Jong-un by elevating his stature to that of the United States is a blunder that I have talked about on many occasions, and I still think it applies. Now, Mike Pence, in the typical style of the Trump administration, at first said that the U.S. would agree to talks without precondition. President Moon and I reflected last night on the need to do something fundamentally different, he said. But then he returned to the status quo and announced conditions, preconditions. He said that allies, including the U.S., at the outset of any new dialogue or negotiations, would demand that North Korea put denuclearization on the table and take concrete steps with the world community to dismantle permanently and irreversibly their nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Now, that's not fundamentally different, and those are preconditions. But that's what Mike Pence thinks is a coherent thought. He went on, then and only then will the world community consider negotiating and making changes in the sanctions regime that's placed on them today. Now, yesterday I received word from a listener, activist, and subscriber to the Peter B. Collins podcast, Grant Gibson from Portland, Oregon. And I got to meet Grant a couple of years ago when I was doing a podcast seminar in Portland at the University of Oregon. And he came and stopped by. I got to meet him. And he has put up a petition at change.org entitled No Sanctions for North Korea. Instead, engage them with commerce. And in a petition that is like 4 paragraphs long, it alternates between English and what I presume is Korean. Grant Gibson writes, the Trump administration is planning a new round of sanctions against the North Korean people in an effort to dislodge its authoritarian leader. When sanctions are imposed, they make only the people suffer. The leaders don't even feel it. It is estimated that 1 baby will die each day due to these proposed sanctions. Do you support punishing the North Korean people for the rhetoric that comes from its leader, who the citizens cannot control? I do not. And Grant goes on to say that he lived in South Korea, for an extended period of time, and, quote, I can tell you they are not called the Irish of Asia for nothing. Koreans are a kind, generous, hard-working, and reasonable people until you try to push them around. If you attempt to push them around, they will dig their heels in and fight you with everything they have. These people have endured and survived a brutal Japanese occupation this way. It is deep in their national character. And he concludes, join me in not only opposing sanctions, but in the effort to propose an entirely new approach to North Korea. Along with opposing new sanctions, I propose that we 1. Work to include North Korea in our international trade networks, 2. Offer North Korea a real peace treaty that will establish an internationally recognized border and retire the 1953 armistice agreement, and 3. Open up cultural exchanges and make our universities available to young aspiring North Koreans. If you want to change North Korea, you need to do it through trade and exchanges, not through brutality. Well, I signed Grant's petition. I'm linking to the change.org page, and I invite you to do so as well. I think that it is an important expression, and we've seen that, Cuba didn't change because of over 50 years of isolation and sanctions, and we are really pursuing a dead end with North Korea under the current scheme. Over in Israel, at a military court, 17-year-old Ahed Tamimi, the beautiful girl with blue eyes and the big curly hair, who slapped an Israeli soldier who had staked out her family's home and refused to leave. And I recall looking at the video at the time, and when you see the whole sequence, Ahed was slapped first. But we don't include the whole story here. The judge in the military case ordered a closed-door hearing, ejected a large group of journalists who had gathered at the Ofer military base. Tamimi's supporters say that the incident in December occurred soon after she discovered Israeli troops had seriously wounded her 15-year-old cousin, who was shot in the head with a rubber bullet during a stone-throwing clash. Then the Israelis came in the dark of night, arrested this young woman. She has been jailed without bail since, and she is facing 12 charges, some of which precede the December incident. And here's a quote from Amnesty International's Magdalena Mugrabi. As an unarmed girl, Ahed posed no threat during the altercation with the 2 Israeli soldiers who were heavily armed and wearing protective clothing. Yet again, the Israeli authorities have responded to acts of defiance by a Palestinian child with measures that are entirely disproportionate to the incident in question. And because of the blonde, blue-eyed traits in the family, one senior Israeli official, in a racist move, revealed that he had asked a parliamentary committee to investigate whether they were real Palestinians. And piling on, in another racist comment, the culture minister Miri Regev says, "She is not a little girl, she is a terrorist. It's about time they will understand that people like her have to be in jail and not be allowed to incite racism and subversion against the state of Israel." Isn't that pretty? You accuse others of racism as you brazenly practice it. Meanwhile, the case against Benjamin Netanyahu has built to the point that Israeli police have handed off 2 of the 4 investigations to prosecutors, recommending that Netanyahu and I think his wife be prosecuted for 2 counts of corruption and fraud. And I want to note that there are 4 cases. 2 continue to be investigated. The third case, Case 3000, is much more serious than the first 2, but the Washington Post, in covering this story, didn't bother to mention the other investigations. So there's Case 1000, gifts of cigars and jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of shekels given to Sarah and Benjamin Netanyahu from benefactors. Case 2000 involves a deal made between Bibi and Arnon Moses, the publisher of the Israeli daily Yedioth Aronoth, and the deal was that Netanyahu would essentially downplay Sheldon Adelson's free daily newspaper, Israel Hayam, in favor of the other paper. But I went to the great Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which is a Zionist outlet, but they allow critical coverage of the Israeli government. And to get the details on Case 3000, also known as the submarine affair, which is really serious, doesn't directly involve Netanyahu, but his cronies have apparently benefited from this $1 billion submarine deal between Israel and Germany. And just this past Sunday, the former bureau chief of Netanyahu, David Sharon, was detained on suspicions of taking bribes in the case. So I hasten to add that to this point, Netanyahu has not been directly implicated, but his circle of associates and advisors have been, and it theoretically could affect Netanyahu himself as the investigation continues. And the fourth is called the Bezek affair. It began with a state report published last July on a problematic relationship between the communications ministry and Bezek, spelled B-E-Z-E-Q, Israel's telecom giant. And the bottom line here is that associates of Netanyahu, including a guy who was brought in to replace a man who had been fired, played favorites in relation to broadband reform, and they did favors for Bezek. So it's going to be interesting to see. And with the Tamimi case, that's an opportunity for Netanyahu to grandstand and be a hardline Zionist to the Israeli public. The interactions, the conflict, and the downed F-16 in Syria over the weekend also I see as ways that Netanyahu will strengthen his slipping hold on power. Back here in the U.S., the top spooks paraded before the Senate Intelligence Committee today and produced a little contradiction with the Trump White House. Now, most notably, the freshest face there, Chris Wray, the new FBI director who was installed last summer, he contradicted the White House timeline about the domestic abuse scandal involving Rob Porter, who resigned under fire last week. And we've gotten shifting timelines about who knew what and when. And this is turning into what could have been a one-day story is now advancing to its first week, and there's no end in sight. So Chris Wray didn't disclose the contents of the Bureau's files on Mr. Porter. But he said that after issuing a partial report to the White House last March, the FBI gave the administration a completed background investigation in late July. They then, White House requested a follow-up inquiry, and that was completed in November. And he said that Porter's background check investigation was administratively closed in January, weeks before the allegations against Porter were publicly known. Now, this puts both Trump, as a sex offender himself, who has defended those who have been accused, and I agree about due process, and Senator Gillibrand of New York had the great comeback for Trump's tweets over the weekend, saying, yeah, let's have some due process. Let's investigate Trump. And the allegations of over a dozen women, I think the last count is 18. But that never shuts him up. Anyway, Chris Wray is basically saying that the White House is full of shit and that the FBI did its job. It closed the investigation, and yet Porter remained on the job handling sensitive classified material, apparently just on the say-so of the president. So this one, as I say, will continue to grind away inside the Beltway. Meanwhile, we also heard warnings in this same hearing from Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence and a former senator from Indiana. And this is so confounding, all right? Because they make these really vague claims that Russia is getting ready to disrupt the 2018 midterm elections. But they don't claim that they're going to secretly support one candidate over another, or that they're going to hack into election systems to produce whatever their desired result is. No, it's more propaganda, using fake Americans, using people sympathetic to their messages, fake personalities on social media, many of them run by bots, to sow further political and social divisions in the United States. Now, this is so bizarre, because on the one hand, it's juicy that they believe in the Russia meddled in the election meme, and their boss doesn't. But the other side of it is they are embracing an incoherent thought and a series of ideas about what Russia might do to disrupt American culture. And we're doing a bang-up job of it ourselves. We don't need Russian bots to divide Americans along racial or economic lines. In a moment, we'll get to the budget blueprint issued by the White House, which further separates the poor from the ultra-wealthy in this country. You think those divisions won't surface in the electoral process this year? And the media malpractice that occurs on a daily basis in this country, where important issues are shoved aside to bring us Kardashians and Trumps and all kinds of bullshit? Dan Coates, quote, "There should be no doubt that Russia perceives its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations." I mean, this is just so bizarre and disconnected. And they never mention that some of this could be retaliation for the aggressive, offensive actions of the U.S. Cyber Command. It's got a huge budget, a bunch of people. We don't know what they're up to. We don't know who they're hacking, who they're pretending to be on any given day. Mike Pompeo piled on, "We have seen Russian activities and intentions to have an impact on the next election cycle." Well, what the hell does that mean? And what are you going to do about it? Huh? Oh, boy. Meanwhile, this story gets no play at all. It was published in the Sunday New York Times. I've seen zero coverage of it elsewhere. And maybe I'm the only guy left in America who cares about the injustice at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The gulag that we have set up, the kangaroo courts called military commissions that are intended to produce guilty verdicts and death sentences no matter what. And the top guy in the structure of the military commissions was, without any warning or notice, he was sacked last week by Defense Secretary Mad Dog Mattis. You've never heard of him. His name is Harvey Rishikoff, and his title was Convening Authority. And the convening authority has the latitude to cut deals with the defendants in the cases before the military commission. And in this case, it's the 5 defendants in the 9/11 case. And it's reported that Rishikoff, seeing that it's all deadlocked because the government doesn't want to allow use of evidence of torture or the disclosure of the black sites, which are no longer secret, but they claim they have to be kept secret in the Guantanamo proceedings. And in order to avoid that, Rishikoff was looking at this and saying, well, let's just get this over with. Let's accept some plea deals and lock these guys up forever and try to move on. Now, I don't think that's justice, but Harvey Rishikoff was well within his rights to conduct these conversations. But Jim Mattis disagreed, and perhaps on instructions from the White House, summarily fired Rishikoff and his top counsel last week. In the Senate, it's day 2 of an unstructured debate about an immigration bill. And this is novel in many ways. Usually a committee will propose legislation, and if they approve it, it goes to the floor where senators might make some amendments before they pass it or kill it. And this is all being done on the floor. Now, I appreciate the transparency here, but I have no optimism that this is going to lead to any kind of an immigration bill that I can support, except to the extent that it gives relief to the dreamers. But the price is going to be extracted, and it's going to be a big one. And that's what I fear as these deliberations continue over the next few days. Every day I pause briefly to thank people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. Like linear Bob Getzla, just renewed his annual subscription. Mona Kobus, Anna Gordonier, and Brian Mazzy are monthly subscribers to the PBC Podcast. I would like you to join them. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com. You click on menu, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It gets you to the sign-up page, and you can select a level of support that's comfortable for you and your budget. I much appreciate it. Well, I took some time because yesterday I really couldn't analyze the dead-on-arrival Trump budget plan that was revealed. But it really is disgusting. and it is an oligarch's blueprint. Now, the budget deal that was rammed through in the middle of the night last Friday morning basically makes this document meaningless. But it tells us what the intentions of Trump and the Republicans are, and they will continue to whack away over the next few years. So, Trump had said he would never cut Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. This budget proposes cutting Medicare by $500 billion and Medicaid by about $250 billion. He also said that he would balance the budget very quickly, but the plan shows trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see, and adding at least $7 trillion to the $20 trillion existing debt over the next 10 years. And, of course, the tax cuts exacerbate that. And the budget that shifts so much new money to the Pentagon is taken from, food stamps and other safety net programs here in the U.S. So it's very ugly. Couple of more items. They want to zero out funding for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I learned yesterday that the CFPB has dropped a case against an online lender, a payday lender, that was gouging people with interest rates up to 900%. No problem there. Nick Mulvaney, he's going to rubber stamp that. They want to cut $2.5 billion from the EPA. And this is not going to reduce the size of government, which is the long-term goal of Grover Norquist and all these Republican right-wing idiots who rail about the deficit when there's a black Democrat in the White House, but they revel in deficit spending when they get into power. And we've already covered the defense budget and just how much I object to the increases and the fact that Democrats don't oppose them. Now to the infrastructure plan, this is just a joke. He's offering $200 billion in federal money, and he's demanding that state and local governments come up with the rest. And the new formula, keep in mind, you used to drive down the freeway and there'd be a sign that says your tax dollars at work, and there'd be a construction crew there upgrading the pavement or whatever. And you would see the breakdown of the funding. And the feds always kicked in 70, 80, sometimes 90% of the money for these infrastructure projects. Well, now they want to reverse that and basically demand that state and local taxpayers come up with the money to fix their own roads and infrastructure with just a little help from Washington. And the tax cuts that they rammed through right before Christmas undermine any prospects that states could pass new taxes to pay for infrastructure, because those taxes are capped in terms of their deductibility against the federal tax that one owes. So this is just maddening, it's wheel spinning, and it exposes priorities for privatization, to give corporate control to the Bonneville Power System, to the Tennessee Valley Authority, to Dulles and National Airports in Washington. And last night on the NewsHour, they trotted out the mayor of Los Angeles, Democrat Eric Garcetti, who has made it clear he wants to run for president in 2020 from being mayor of L.A. Now, as if that's not far-fetched enough, he served up a lot of warmed-over spit that really annoyed me. Now, when Garcetti talked about the Dreamers and about immigration issues, he was very effective. But he was speaking for the U.S. Council of Mayors, and maybe that shifted his talking points a bit. But when he was asked about Trump's plans to cut regulation to speed infrastructure development and repair, he was all for it. So he wants to cut workplace safety rules. He wants to allow workers to get injured or die on the job. He wants to suspend environmental regulations and put a freeway or bridge in there because, really, who cares? We all know it's okay. Now, I do understand that if it takes 5 to 10 years to approve a project from drawing board to the first shovel, That's too long, and that is annoying. But to just fast-track all this stuff and ignore regulatory frameworks that it took us decades to develop is really wrong. And if that's what Eric Garcetti is going to run on for president, good luck, dude. You remember how the gun nuts told us that Obama was coming for their guns? And that's why they had to buy more. Every time there was a mass shooting, we'd see a spike in gun sales around the country. Well, we now are under what is called the Trump slump because gun owners are expecting no new regulations, and they've eased off in their buying so much that the Remington Arms Company has filed for bankruptcy. Now, they were sold and loaded up on $950 million in debt, so some of this is a convenient way to wiggle out of that. But the owner of Smith & Wesson reported its profits have fallen 90% year over year. Sales fell 36%. Sturm Ruger, the U.S. largest firearm manufacturer, says its quarterly revenues have fallen by 35%. Now, what's interesting is that only 3% of the population owns an average of 17 guns each. There's an estimated 7.7 million super owners in possession of 140 guns apiece. And by the way, Remington was taken over by the hedge fund Cerberus Capital Management. They also own the supermarket chain Safeway now, which they're busy raiding before they try to pop it into an IPO and sell the downgraded system to somebody else. Also, on the gun control front, the military has quietly added about 4,000 dishonorable discharge records to the system that is supposed to block those individuals from being able to own weapons. Now, this followed the shooting near San Antonio last fall when Devin Kelly, an Air Force veteran, used a rifle to kill dozens of people at the church in Sutherland Springs. So I'm not sure that'll have an impact, but there it is. In New York City tomorrow, a novel lawsuit opens a trial. The lawsuit challenges the constitutionality and the basic reasonableness that marijuana is still considered a Schedule I drug under the Drug Enforcement Act. And this case includes a former pro football player who has a business selling pot-based pain relievers, a 12-year-old girl from Colorado who treats her chronic epilepsy with medical marijuana. And it appears this case is being taken seriously and may produce a result that I'd like to see. The 98-page complaint includes historical references that Thomas Jefferson smoked weed for migraines. James Madison credited sweet hemp for giving him insight to create a new and democratic nation. So we'll be watching this one and see where it goes. Meanwhile, just across the bay and a bridge away from me, the People's Republic of Berkeley is considering declaring itself a sanctuary city for cannabis. Tonight, they will consider an ordinance that would declare that city agencies and employees are barred from using resources and funds to assist in enforcing federal marijuana laws. Agencies would also be prohibited from turning over information on legal cannabis activity as defined by state law to federal authorities. There's a bit of a kerfuffle in Washington, and I want to credit Rachel Maddow, reported this last night, and there's been spotty follow-up. This story has not been covered, as far as I know, by the New York Times or the Washington Post today. But Senators Chuck Grassley and Lindsey Graham are calling on former National Security Advisor Susan Rice to explain an email she wrote to herself at about the moment when Donald Trump was being installed during the inauguration last January 20th. Rice emailed herself about a briefing that took place earlier in the month on January 5th last year with where Obama met with FBI Director Comey, Acting Attorney General Sally Yates, and Vice President Joe Biden, along with Susan Rice. So she wrote the memo, which appears to be a cover-your-ass email. It was top secret, but it's been declassified. And she wrote that Obama wants to be sure that as we engage with the incoming team, we are mindful to ascertain if there is any reason we cannot share information fully as it relates to Russia. And she also declared that Obama insisted that everything be conducted by the book. Now, maybe this is harmless, but it sure looks suspicious at this point. Interesting story in Vice News today. They're going after their competitor BuzzFeed, tweaking them. BuzzFeed released the Christopher Steele dossier last January and now has several lawsuits pending about libel or other forms of misreporting. And they've hired Anthony Ferrante to investigate whether the P-tape actually exists and other aspects of the the Steele dossier. And I find this amusing because it's been over a year, and nobody, either as an authority or in the media, has bothered to carefully scrutinize this and give us a sense of what's true and what's not. And so Ferrante, who joined the FBI in 2005, oversaw the investigation into Russia's meddling in the 2016 election while he was at the White House. That really builds confidence, doesn't it? Oh, by the way, I want to recommend a fresh podcast. It's called The Moderate Rebels. Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton expose the funding behind Vice and criticize its coverage in ways that I find quite compelling. I've linked to in the show file for today's podcast to their podcast, and you can check it out. I also want to recommend that you listen to Jennifer Briney's latest Congressional Dish podcast, where she uses the information from the current National Defense Authorization Act to explain our role in Ukraine's coup a couple of years ago. And I am scheduled to interview Jennifer next week for the Peter B. Collins podcast. In the meantime, if you can listen to Congressional Dish, I highly recommend it. That's my time for today here at the Peter B. Collins News and Comment Podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. We post it on YouTube, where people listen to it all over the world. And if you go to YouTube, click that subscribe thing, will you? I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.